It's easy to talk about all the mistakes that have been done on Iran. Let's talk about what gets you the grade on the report card. What if I said the only grade on the report card is, have we had a conventional war in the Middle East that involved Iran and all the neighbors? Does Iran have a nuclear weapon? Sounds like we get an A grade. Now, if you expand that optic to a variety of other issues, suddenly you start hoping for grading on a curve, and then eventually you hope for a gentleman's C, and then finally you just hope that it's a pass, fail, and last of all, you hope the parents don't look at the report card.
Welcome to Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis, a series of casual conversations on the most important events in the Middle East region today. I'm Brian Katulis. I'm Middle East Institute's Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Norman Roule. Norm is on the advisory council of our Iran program here at the Middle East Institute. He has many affiliations around town, but two important things about Norm. One, he has more than 3 decades of public service in the U.S. government at the Central Intelligence Agency. For the topics we're going to be talking about today, for about a 9-10 year period, he was the National Intelligence Manager on Iran from November of 2008 till September of 2017, which was a very crucial period in U.S. policy on Iran. We'll talk a lot about that. Secondly, most importantly, I consider Norm a friend and a mentor, someone I can call up all the time, and he'll just tell it like it is and give me good advice, not only on what's going on in the world, but set me straight on a lot of things. He speaks straight. I'm really honored that you fought the traffic and you're here at the Middle East Institute this afternoon, Norm.
No, thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here. The Middle East Institute is a storied institution. I've been coming here since, I think, before some of your staff was born. I've been working Middle East issues since the Dead Sea was just feeling under the weather. And this institution and the wisdom it has put out has always been a guide to me and a benefit. So I'm grateful and honored to be here today.
Well, thanks and cheers to you for coming all the way down here and having this conversation. Let's start out this conversation with the current moment in the Middle East. We're basically at the end of a pretty dramatic 6-month period when you think about what's happened here. Israel taking out the top leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah. Earlier this month, the fall of the Assad regime. Big picture, what do you see today as we draw 2024 to an end? The big strategic trends across the Middle East. What are the opportunities? I always like to start with opportunities. And what are the big threats that you see today?
More so than any time since 1945, the Middle East is contested space. It's contested. We are listening to the death rattles of Iran's proxies, of the Assad regime. We're watching a region that no longer has a unifying ideology or a single political direction. We're watching a region that has a very young population that is not tied to ideologies that might as well have been in the Jurassic Age for all they care. We're watching a region of broken states and fragile states, but also transformational states, and that's the opportunity. The question is, will we be interested in seizing this opportunity? And I actually don't see a lot of momentum for partnering yet with the region to build for a future as much as dealing with crises of today.
Be more specific. What do you mean about those opportunities? Which are those transformational states, and why are you, sounds like you're skeptical about whether we'll seize these opportunities?
Well, we're watching in the Gulf states, primarily Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, very focused capital, very focused political ambitions that have improved women's rights, that are bringing technology in to transform the engines of economies that, if done correctly, would splash out in some of the fragile states and the broken states, not only in the region, but in East Africa, which is in desperate need of economic, political, and social progress. This is an opportunity for the West, the United States, to partner not with these countries on what they're doing today, but partnering with them in the way that says, how do we expand that splash of progress? They're going to be ripples or wrinkles of bumps and problems. We can expect that. But don't we all want to see a Middle East that endorses women's rights? At a time when the Taliban have returned women's rights to the Middle Ages, don't we want to see the Red Sea become an area of progress and prosperity? Well, the Saudis and the Emiratis are investing hundreds of billions of dollars over the next decades in their future, and it will inevitably touch that. The proper role of the West is to say, go to it, but how do we marry our economies, our technologies, and our policies to expand the impact of that? Because if we don't, we still have fragile states that could well become broken states.
Let me press you on this, because I'm not disagreeing with you here, but is this moment unprecedented? Or have we seen periods like this where countries in the region, including those like Saudi Arabia, have taken some steps towards women's rights? And I have to say, I would go back to your own record. You lived across the region. You're an international man of mystery, worked in some of these countries. We can't talk about all of the work that you did, but you've witnessed different phases. And I remember that period after George W. Bush came to office, and a lot of the Gulf states were taking some steps towards economic transformation, to women being in leadership roles in ministries and ambassadorships here in the United States. What is different about this moment in 2024 heading into 2025 that you see differently coming from the leaders of these countries and the people?
It's dramatically different, and the potential is dramatically greater. Technology is now changing the entire topography of the region. We're dealing with countries that 5 years ago, women in Saudi Arabia couldn't drive, and now half of their astronauts are women. And they've already put one into space.
Yeah.
The Emiratis are doing the same thing. The head of their space program with her extraordinary Mars Explorer was a magnificent female minister. She's now moved on to another ministry. You now have women in roles of authority. You have women doing their thing in economies, in business, in banking. And this is an opportunity to take this example and move this out into the region. Because remember, these are also multicultural countries. So you've got people from Asia and Europe and the Americas and Africa in these countries working, and they will go back with these experiences and say, this is a good thing. We should be part of this.
So what you're talking about is a Middle East today in 2024, heading into 2025, that is serving as a bridge, as a link between the engines of the global economy, and that people are there, they're working together, and they're trying to build something. It's not just the parade of horribles that we see about conflict in the news. What you said earlier is that why we might not seize this moment is because we get so consumed by the threats and missing the opportunities, that we don't have a proactive approach to imagine a different future. Is that what you're saying?
We don't seem to be spending much time on the future as much as we're spending time on this afternoon. The thing about the Middle East is, and I don't mean this as a sarcastic statement, but the Middle East is in the middle. It's in the middle between Europe and Asia, between India and Africa, between global north and global south. And the countries with this capital and these ambitions are no longer seeing themselves as leaders of the region, but you're looking at the Emirates, which played this enormous role putting together COP28.
Yeah.
You're seeing the Saudis, who are having almost weekly, if not thrice weekly, conferences of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, to the African Union, to the GCC. This is an opportunity for this central location, which is bringing together entertainment, transportation, communications, energy, but most importantly, the investment and capital in things like artificial intelligence and tomorrow's technology, space programs.
Yeah.
And magnify that for a broader region. We've not had this opportunity in the past. It's not just that they're looking at the future, they're making the future happen now. They're not perfect. It's not happening without, as I say, wrinkles. We may not like everything they do, but by God, this is transformational in a way that we have not seen since the end of the Second World War.
So how do you suggest that U.S. policymakers can seize upon a more proactive approach, whether it's the last few weeks of the Biden administration or the incoming Trump administration? Because there's this phrase that some former Obama officials would talk about, their long game, and they would talk about climate change, and they would talk about the need to build greater connectivity, often not in the Middle East, I would say. They would often talk about it as it relates to Asia and pivoting to other countries. How do you do that at a moment when the Middle East is actually on fire with conflict, and you've got to respond, and you've got to get hostages out through tough negotiations? It's a hard question, but how would you advise, particularly the incoming Trump administration, to seize this moment of opportunity that you see?
Well, every hard question ends up being answered by long-term solutions that require teams of people who have not only a vision and a decisiveness, but a pool of experience. I don't think we've had sufficient emphasis on building those teams in the interagency world in the Biden administration. I don't mean that as a criticism.
Sure.
They have limited resources, finite bandwidth. They have choices they have to make as to where they want to put their emphasis. It was not on the Middle East. And now the administration that comes in needs to turn to the Middle East and ask them to burden share. Incoming President Trump has made a big deal about talking that NATO needs to play a larger role in its defense. Well, I ask you, and I suggest to your listeners that they take a look at a map. I don't think the Red Sea is next to New York or Los Angeles. And it's very important to Europe, more important in many ways to Europe than the United States. Why is NATO playing a larger role in the Red Sea? So you're looking at something that requires touching several different sets of partners, and it requires a team that is focused on using this energy and maximizing its impact. But that requires vision. And as I say, you need a team that's willing to reach out into all of those different parts of the world and draw them together.
And you're talking about a team here, but one that connects with partners across the world and in particular in the region. You mentioned the Red Sea. Why is it that this Operation Prosperity Guardian, which is about a year old, the effort in the Red Sea, it nominally only includes, I think, Bahrain. I don't know if that's changed recently. And I know you travel a lot regularly to the Gulf and others, and you have conversations of confidence and trust with folks. And I'm not asking you to betray that. But what's your sense as to why some of our partners in the region who want actually to have deeper defense arrangements with the United States, who are desiring something bigger and better, why do they sit on the fence on an operation like this, the Prosperity Guardian, a multilateral effort to try to deal with the Houthi problem in the Red Sea?
I think we've seen the collapse of collective security in the international community. The fabric of international defense against an aggressor has been torn apart, and there hasn't been much effort to really knit it together. I go back to the NATO issue. It is true that Prosperity Guardian had ourselves, the British, for example, but you had ships from Great Britain, France, Greece, Italy, Germany, I'm sure I'm leaving some other countries out, in the Gulf, taking fire. These are NATO naval craft taking fire for the first time, perhaps in NATO's existence. The issue didn't come up during the NATO conference. And that's just insane. If you expect the Saudis, who pretty much stood alone when they were on the receiving end of hundreds of Iranian missiles and drones, or the Emiratis, who had to wait some time for a Western response to the attack on Abu Dhabi by Iranian missiles and drones and the Houthis, to stand up against Iran's proxies, given the damage it can do to their economies, that's just not realistic. But again, with collective security, if this became our fight and they're part of that fight, 17% of the world's trade goes through the Red Sea, 12% of the world's rice. We want to give food to Sudanese refugees through the Red Sea. There are a lot of different reasons you do this. You want to keep climate damage from shipping down, which we're now seeing a lot more damage from longer trips around Africa. You have a lot of reasons the world could have united around the Red Sea, and it didn't. And it basically sent a message to people in the region that they're not going to be involved in a fight, and that does discourage partnership.
Let me ask one more question on this before we turn to Syria and Iran, which are big topics. On this issue of the Red Sea, because it's interesting we're in this discussion right now, because it's, in my view, one of the key urgent strategic questions about that part of the world, but we're not having an effective response to it. How would you characterize China and Russia's relationship to this? Are Chinese ships being hit in the Red Sea? There has been some reporting that Russia may be offering some support to Houthis. I don't know how credible that is in terms of attacking this. Do you see this being like a vortex that is drawing in this wider conflict that we see in the world between the U.S. and Europe on the one hand, and Russia and China and Iran on the other?
Not exactly, but I think we're watching a similar response to the Middle East that we see in other parts of the world. The Western policy with Ukraine appears to be something along the lines of giving them sufficient weapons to defend themselves to victory. But offensive action, deterrence, is not part of that policy. Wear down your adversary. Well, the U.S. military and its partners in the Gulf have performed nobly and extraordinarily. They have great leadership. And we've had, with 2 to 3 aircraft carrier task forces, we've had about 30,000 Americans out there risking their lives, taking dozens of incoming drones and missiles. They've performed superbly, and they have defended well. They have degraded Houthi capacity well, but they have not deterred. And you see the same thing, defending the Houthis to defeat. That's a strange policy. So China is a geoeconomic and geocommercial partner for the region. No interest in becoming a geopolitical or geostrategic security actor. If you're a U.S. military officer, you have the lives of 7,000 personnel protecting primarily Russian and Chinese shipping.
Yeah.
Because Western shipping has adapted to this and is moving around Africa. The policy decision-making from the West in general has been somewhat thin. That's a very unusual environment to be put in if you're in that sort of combat zone. But I can't help wondering, is that a similar environment to what we might see in East Asia or in Eastern Europe?
Let's turn to Syria. We're just today, a few days after the fall of the Assad regime. When this airs, it'll be a week and a half or so. And on December 7th, on the platform known as X, you wrote, "The mood at IRGC HQ and Iran's Supreme Council of National Security tonight must be very dark indeed. No doubt more than a few of these officials harbor quiet thoughts, wondering how long the Islamic Republic will last." You've been watching Iran for decades and working on it. Do you think that today the Islamic Republic is at its weakest and most isolated moment? And where do you think this storyline is going in the region in terms of its position in the region?
Well, the Islamic Republic is certainly isolated. It has just lost its only state ally, Syria. It is certainly much weaker. But if I were in Iran, I would say we've been here before. 2003, they had thousands, tens of thousands of American and Western troops on their Iraq border and Afghan border. They thought they were next. The pressure was sufficient to cause them to end the Ahmad nuclear program, although keeping dual use and other aspects of it aside. You had in 2011 through 2013, they thought the Assad regime was falling at that time as well.
Yeah.
And they didn't have the Houthis at that moment. That would have been their connection to Hezbollah disappearing at the same time, and they took dramatic steps. I think if you're in Iran, the echoes of 2009 remain in the room. They've had significant unrest that touch many, many parts of society since 2017. It is true that opposition in Iran remains leaderless, rudderless, and lacks, I think, cohesive political tissue between economic and labor and student groups, but this can change in a moment. And if you're in Iran, it's really going to be hard for people to say, what is different about us and Assad? What is different about us and Ceausescu?
Yeah.
Now, they will think they're different. They have done an awful lot to preserve the regime since 2009. They've taken a lot of steps to build up security in their country, but it's a restive population. It's a lousy economy. Trump administration is returning, and they're going to barrel forward with maximum pressure again. If you're Iran, you need to find ways to promote stability. Ironically, that could lead them to a nuclear deal.
Right.
But if you're Iran right now, you need to get through a leadership transition. You need to get through a poor period of economy. You need to get to a period where you need to rebuild your proxies. And that takes time. That takes people leaving you alone. And that takes not having to worry about tens of thousands, let alone millions of Iranians pouring into the streets.
I want to ask you a bit about U.S. policy on Iran in a few minutes, but I want to pause a little bit on Syria because we're still in this transformational but deeply uncertain moment. And when you look at events just a few days after the fall of the Assad regime, and you look at the mix of what's going on inside of Syria and the fact that the U.S. conducted strikes against Daesh. Daesh is a threat that has been growing in the last few years, though many Americans have not noticed that. There's new leadership coming to power in some sort of fashion in Damascus. If you were back in government in some of the previous positions that you held, what would you be thinking about today in terms of how to focus the efforts there on policy, what U.S. policy should be doing? What are the priority issues? Is this a good scenario, or is this something that could go sideways really badly for U.S. interests?
The answer to that question, what I would say to policymakers if asked, is something that I have said in the past. It's time to hurry up and slow down.
What do you mean?
We must devote a tremendous amount of resources very quickly to understanding the situation, understanding the threats, weaknesses, and opportunities. This isn't something that various institutions do quickly and overnight or without ceasing work on other issues. So you've got to very quickly decide how important is this going to be compared to these other issues, and marshal resources of your diplomatic, your intelligence, your military forces. And I think the Biden administration has done this with its attacks against Daesh, for example. I think that's an example. At the same time, you slow down.
Yeah.
And you have to slow down because you don't have that information.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that the Hayat Tahrir Shem leadership knows what sort of world it's going to be ruling in 6 weeks or 6 months. And we should have some humility about thinking we can predict that now ourselves. But we do need to make sure that there are no loose chemical weapons in that country. There's no loose uranium from the old North Korean facility that the Israelis hit that somebody might find in the ground and grab. There are a lot of things we need to make sure we do quickly so that we don't face a problem in Jordan in 6 months, or a problem in Turkey, or a problem in Pittsburgh in 6 months. So you do need this hurry up to contain, to understand, to develop opportunities, but then slow down on your policy making because you don't know what you're building. I'll give you an example of slowing down. Right now, we declare Hayat Tahrir Shem be a terrorist organization.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's changed. Now, they're saying all the right things. They're doing all the right things in their first week.
Yeah.
I would like to see, are they able to keep this organization that was welded together by anti-Assad sentiment into a single organization? If they can do that, then we should start opening up exceptions to the terrorist sanctions rules to give them some sort of economic assistance to encourage them to move in a direction. If they can do that, we keep going. If they don't, we don't lift those terrorist designations.
Yeah.
But again, you need to really understand what's happening and to have some agility with your forces before you can actually make decisions. And my concern on Syria is, I want to be careful what I say. I think it doesn't appear as if we've had a lot of policy attention on that.
It's been deprioritized. I mean, it's even, I would go back beyond all of that. I think my view is that the Obama administration really downgraded its focus on Syria because of a number of issues, and that the Trump team had a very, in its first term, erratic approach to it. It wasn't consistent. Trump would tweet certain things, and then Jim Mattis and others would try to counteract that. But in essence, the story of U.S. policy, and our colleague Charles Lister would agree with this. He's written this quite a lot.
Exceptional officer. I encourage everyone listening to read Charles Lister's work.
He essentially has said that the U.S. has disengaged from Syria for quite some time and not prioritized it. And I don't disagree with him. I think that's a strand that goes back previous to Trump, but the latter Obama years. And now the Biden team on Sunday probably said the most after the fall of the Assad regime about Syria than they did in more than 3.5 years in office, in part because they're driven and reacting to events.
That's true. Therefore, the Biden team should be measured now. We can't do anything about the past.
Yeah.
Can't do much about today, but we can do something about what we do going forward. So what is the Biden team doing now to marshal U.S. forces to develop an interagency program to provide an understanding that the Trump administration can use to define policies? This won't happen quickly.
There are some in the Biden administration who say that the downfall of the Assad regime is the product of their policies, not only in the Middle East, but also what they've been doing to stand down Russia and Ukraine and offer support to the Ukrainians. And that this moment also of providing support to Israel, to support what they've done to defend themselves against Hezbollah and the attacks on Iran, that we wouldn't be here in Syria if the Biden team hadn't done essentially what it's done since October 7th, 2023. How do you evaluate that from your perspective?
Perfectly understandable in Washington. There's someone taking a bit of credit for good news in the world. That's not unusual. And there's some truth to it. Russia has, of course, been weakened because of its catastrophic performance in Ukraine, and that performance in Ukraine was made more catastrophic because of U.S. weapons and financial aid to the extraordinarily brave Ukrainian people. That's fair. Likewise, our provision of offensive weaponry to Israel and our years of intelligence and security cooperation with the Israelis, years going through multiple administrations, enabled Israel to devastate Lebanese Hezbollah, which reduced Lebanese Hezbollah's capacity to work on the inside. But I think that's as far as it goes. I think you can make another case to say that it's true that Ukraine may have diverted Moscow's attention, but I'm really not sure what attention that diverted from the aircraft pilots and armored personnel teams in Syria themselves. They had a job to do, relatively narrow front, and they couldn't do it. That's
Yeah.
rot. I'm not sure that rot is only because of Ukraine. That's a question analysts, well, they'll love to answer over a 6-week arguing session without getting anywhere. And the same for Iran itself. There is rot in Iran. They had 20,000 Afghans and proxies. They couldn't move in front of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. That's not because of Lebanese Hezbollah. If you're going to give the current administration credit for what it's done, then you must also point out, in fairness, that the lack of sanctions enforcement against Iran allowed a lot of money to go to the Syrian government and Lebanese Hezbollah that made this harder.
Right.
The lack of a program to undermine proxies meant that weapons flows continued into Syria, and that enabled the Syrian government and the proxies to last longer. The efforts to engage Lebanese Hezbollah, Hamas, or the Houthis by the current administration and previous administrations meant that we weren't degrading their capability while they were building tunnels to move weapons from Syria to Lebanon, tunnels against Israel.
Yeah.
So you can't have it only one way. You've got to look at the whole picture and say, it helped, but there were other policies that seriously made this more difficult, prolonged this day from happening, and may have increased the bloodshed for the people involved.
Yeah, this is the case, I think, in Ukraine, in the Syrian civil war for a long period of time. For those who argue against endless wars and that we need to end endless wars, I think the irony is that sometimes the policies that inform that attitude actually prolong these wars and make them much longer because, as you were saying earlier, it's not a mode of let's deter our adversaries and enemies. It's let's de-escalate the conflict and de-escalate tensions.
Well, actually, I'd say it's a little different.
Okay.
You're correct. The wars don't become endless. Our involvement may cease. We just cease talking about it.
Yeah.
I think if you went to the amazing Charles Lister, he would tell you the number of Syrians who continued to die every week during a war that didn't touch the front pages of the Washington Post. It didn't sound like that endless war went away.
Right.
If you talk to the American personnel on naval assets in the Red Sea who are on the receiving end of about half of all Houthi missiles and drones,
Yes.
they're not going to tell you that endless war went away.
Right.
So it just comes down to the people who talk about endless wars going away usually just cease talking. One more little tweak, and I don't mean to be sarcastic or cynical. The current administration also talked about the need to avoid regime change. Well,
And now we have regime change.
I think we have regime change in Syria. Is anybody standing up and saying that that was a bad idea?
My view also on this question of regime change, it's sort of the word people don't want to talk about as it relates to Iran. But a lot of those same people are the ones that are talking about the need for regime change in Saudi Arabia because the monarchy is doing this and that, or regime change in Israel because they don't like the current government. So, I think, okay, we can come up with a different phrase for it, but people actually often talk about changing the nature of political authority. And in the case of Syria, and I think also in the case of Iran, the irony is a lot of the people who are involved in summits for democracy and saying that they're in favor for freedom and human rights, including here at home, often turn a blind eye in parts of the Middle East, including Syria, including Iran, although there is a very strong voice for Palestinians and supporting their rights. And it's selective is my main point.
And not to drive the nail too hard home, but one might also say that a shift in Afghan policy resulted in a regime change there.
Oh, 100%. So let's turn quickly, and it's still early days, and the Trump team is not back into office yet. But President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect J.D. Vance did make their voice known on Syria pretty early on after the fall of the regime. And they had the same message, which is this is a mess, and we should stay out. Now, I'm not asking you a political question. I'm asking you a policy question. How do you assess that? And based on the Trump team's record on Syria, what might this mean on January 20th, 21st, in terms of how they approach the Syria challenge as a policy question?
I think it was quite a wise statement. I want to unpack why. Syria should be decided first and foremost by the Syrian people. Okay? These people may need assistance against thugs and goons with guns. That's fair.
Yeah.
But this is also a regional problem. If you're in Jordan, if you're in Saudi Arabia, if you're in Israel or Turkey, it's your neighborhood, and you should have the biggest voice on what happens in your neighborhood and not a country 6,000 miles away. Now, do we have a reason to push back on Daesh? Sure we do. But Europe has a greater reason to push back on Daesh. And I go back to the Red Sea comment.
Yeah.
Why don't we have a greater role for Europe inside of eastern Syria? If you look at President-elect Trump's comment through that lens, it's exactly where U.S. policy should be. We do need to partner and support people, provide humanitarian support, protect the people who need it, give them advice and counsel. But this is the Middle East Institute with the smartest people in Washington, perhaps the United States on the Middle East. And I would still say that the people in the Middle East know the region and their problems a little better.
There you go, folks. Middle East first. Make the Middle East great again. Norm Roule. The region should take the lead. You worked, if I understand it, in a very senior position as the National Intelligence Manager at the Directorate of National Intelligence through at least 3 administrations, if I'm correct. You were in that position from George W. Bush through 2 Obama terms, and then early part of the Trump administration, correct?
Correct. And for the record, it was described when I arrived and throughout the entire assignment as a 1-year assignment.
So they must have liked you, or they must have liked what you were doing, at least, if they didn't like you personally. And in that position, it put you in a lot of face time with senior policymakers across administrations and the challenges that were posed in this period by Iran, right? It was a dynamic period, as we talked about, concerns about the nuclear program. A lot was going on there. When you think about that period, particularly when you were there, you continue to follow it, and I turn to you for your wisdom on Iran policy all the time, and you think about the big strategic picture and the lessons for U.S. policy. And here, I don't want to be just 2020 hindsight. I want your 2020 hindsight on U.S. policy on Iran as it relates to the future and what we should do next. What are your biggest lessons in terms of what you saw from that perch that U.S. policymakers did well on Iran policy? And then what were the biggest mistakes that we should learn the lessons from as we move forward?
It's easy to talk about all the mistakes that have been done on Iran because the problem has been that we have whipsawed between engagement and confrontation with the same group of leaders in Iran who now know they can outlast us. They've seen our playbook. And our playbook is often put out in our press. And I think one of the problems maybe recently is we've used the same people in front of the Iranians. When you stare into the abyss stares back. And if we're able to say, boy, we understand the Iranians and we know who's there, well, they can say the same thing. And they just have to outlast us. There is another problem, and diplomacy must remain our first choice. Diplomacy with partners must remain our first choice. But diplomacy must have a coercive element and a finite tool. And it's often said of military officers, they just never will give up trying to take that hill. And you've got to tell them, no, we're going to end the war here. That didn't happen with diplomats.
Yeah.
And engagement has its cost. There have been people who've said, can't get rid of Hezbollah. We need to engage with them, treat them as members of the polity, all of Iran's proxies. Well, they built tunnels. They built tunnels that killed people, to include now Lebanese and Palestinians have died in these maelstroms, these conflicts, these cauldrons.
Yeah.
The Iranians, through engagement, through JCPOA, did this. We also don't talk about the price of engagement. So the JCPOA, people often ask, is it a good or bad deal? And I make no comment because as even a former intelligence officer, our job was to provide information. Those are policy calls. Right. It absolutely reduced Iran's nuclear program in size, placed it under unprecedented international restrictions with long-term but finite restrictions, okay? And it gave them enough money to fund regional proxies to kill men, women, and children. You can't have the argument to the benefit of JCPOA publicly without talking about the deaths of men, women, and children that are associated with sanctions relief. We don't talk about that. Instead, it's become a very political issue.
But isn't that part of the strategy that the regime in Tehran has had, which is to essentially say, we'll talk to you endlessly about our nuclear program, but all of these other issues related to our actions in the region that are destabilizing, we're going to defer that. We don't want to have a conversation about.
They've actually said we will not stay in the room if you raise them.
Do you think that posture has changed after this year of losses?
And that goes back to one of my earliest statements. It's got to be a deal that isn't temporary. You need to basically say, Iran, if it has a nuclear weapon or attempts to build a nuclear weapon, we will use military power. One more footnote on that, or one more error, something I've watched during this time. We had a shift where suddenly we started to treat Iran as if it had a nuclear weapon. The conversation became, if you bump 2 boats in the Gulf, ours and theirs, suddenly it's 300,000 American personnel in a 20-year war that costs $1 trillion while the world calls us idiots. And the Chinese and the Russians stand back and watch our technology. There is no reason that if Iran threatens American lives, we don't conduct kinetic operations against them, just as President Clinton did against the Iraqis when they threatened the life of former President Bush, and President Reagan did against the Libyans.
Yeah.
Not every action leads to war. And we've got to end this narrative, which is not based on fact, that any action automatically leads to a 20-year war. I want to pull one more thread. We put 2 aircraft carrier task forces in the Arabian Gulf recently. They were the most powerful technological warfighting forces ever deployed in the history of the planet. Those 2 task forces could have overturned the military of any medium-sized country on the planet. Yet when Iran fired 200 missiles, we didn't send one missile in against one missile launcher to stop missiles that were flying against men, women, and children somewhere, to include the hundreds of thousands of American passport holders who live in Israel. At some point, Iran must feel that something besides a symbolic sanction is what it will face for lethal activity conducted against particularly Americans.
2 last questions on Iran, and then we'll move to the close. If Trump 2.0 administration turns to maximum pressure 2.0, do you think that the architecture of where the region is at today, especially the Gulf states, and given that they suffered some attacks, significant attacks, during that maximum pressure 1.0, and when I go to the region and I talk to some of the same leaders you talk to as well, I see a reserve, more of a reticence. Maybe you don't share this view. And part of it is connected to their perception that we're not necessarily with them and reliable in any sort of way. Would they be on board? It's hard to predict, but if Trump moves in this direction to a much more back to maximum pressure 2.0, would they be with us, given that they've also opened up, some of these countries opened up diplomatic ties that they didn't have during that first Trump administration, the rapprochement, or whatever you would call it, between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Would they be part of that, or are they so focused on rebuilding their economic models in a different way, they want to avoid a big war?
Well, they'd certainly like to avoid a war. They'd certainly like diplomacy to succeed. Their eyes are wide open on Iran. It is not a rapprochement, it is a détente, much as we had with the Soviet Union, which meant we're not going to enable their economy to do things in any substantial way against us, but we're not going to do anything to start a war.
Yeah.
That's where things stand. But moving forward, I don't think it's just the Trump administration. I don't believe there was ever any doubt that in the first Trump administration that they would respond to aggression by Iran. But I do believe there was a sense that where would Congress be in 6 weeks or 2 months? And if you're in the Gulf, it's not an unfair thing to think about as you're listening to the Americans. You know, if a war starts, it's going to start in their front yards, go into their living rooms, their bathrooms, bedrooms, and backyards. And we're 6,000 miles away. At no times has Mohammed bin Salman or Prime Minister Netanyahu sought an all-out war that would result in the destruction of their economies and much of their sectors. They have sought the destruction of Iran's nuclear program, but they're not looking for a war. So the question becomes, in a Trump administration, what policies do we bring that actually degrade Iran? What capacities do we bring that ensures their defense in a very, very difficult to defend geography? And then where does Congress stand with this point? I think that will decide where the Gulf partners will go. But I need to reinforce that their eyes are wide open on Iran and its malign adventurism and the dangers of its nuclear program.
There's not a lot of trust there. So last question on Iran. You mentioned earlier that Iran and its proxies literally dug physical tunnels. And we saw this in Lebanon, in Gaza, and in other places. One thing, back to this question of U.S. policy and the debate about Iran, did the Iranian regime over the last decade or so dig tunnels into our debate here in the United States? Was there an influence operation to try to shape how we all talk about Iran? And I don't want to sound like a Middle East conspiracy theorist and things like this.
No, it's quite accurate. And in fact, what you see is Iran understands that if they prod us or we provoke an action, our social media has us turning against each other. And even our, maybe propaganda is too hard, it shows evidence of this. So Iran just needs to threaten the worst and watch us turn against each other. And that's why, and I think you and I would agree with this, perhaps two great foundational weaknesses of policy were, first, it abandoned or fractured a bipartisan approach on Iran. Yeah. And secondly, there were legitimate regional security issues that were not addressed. And instead, we talked about standing with allies who were standing about 3,000 to 4,000 miles away and outside of missile range of Iran.
Yeah.
They weren't partners in the region who were under and eventually came under routine Iranian missile and drone attack.
Those partisan divisions and then sort of the regional security threats were the two big concerns I had. I was at a different think tank, but I was in favor of the JCPOA. But you had messaging coming out of the Obama White House in that second term that essentially said, if you don't vote for this JCPOA, you're voting for another war like the one we just had in Iraq. And to me, it's that false choice messaging that actually has confused and convoluted the policy debate.
Actually exacerbated the domestic political tensions with the United States. At a time when we talk about pulling ourselves together, JCPOA became one of the corrosive elements dividing Americans from each other. And it really shouldn't have been. The deal should have been posed as something that basically was an opportunity for Iran.
Yeah.
And if Iran took the opportunity, life is good. We did something good, moved on. But if they didn't, it's not our fault. It's the Iranian fault.
How did you get into the line of work that you chose in your life? I mean, you can't talk, because you're an international man of mystery, about decades of what you did in your life, and I'm certain it helped make America safer. But if you were to speak to the next generation, and I've seen you do it, what would you tell them about, if they wanted to follow in your footsteps, what they need to do?
Working for the U.S. intelligence community was a singular honor that was like winning the lottery. I didn't deserve it. I was a junior in college, and I was approached in a program that no longer exists. And I had multiple majors. I was going to school at nights, weekends, and summer vacations. I was part of many different organizations. I was just approached by a professor who said, you should talk to these people. They put me to work. I came in with some languages. They said, you're needed here. I'm also from a small coal mining town in southwestern Pennsylvania, where when I grew up, the Second World War was still part of our social dynamic. People talked about what it was like on Normandy Beach and what got us there. And by the way, the steps that weren't taken that ended up with my Uncle Norman, after whom I'm named, landing at Omaha Beach. Wow. And fighting his way through France, his units decimated, and finally they're told, you can have a rest in December 1944 in a place called the Ardennes. Mm-hmm. Not a great Christmas vacation. Yeah. For Uncle Norman. God bless him. And then I came into the agency, and the agency put me to work.
Yeah.
And I will say one more little twist. Gus Avracatus, who I've never said this public before, he recruited me.
The guy in Charlie Wilson's War, right?
And all of your listeners should watch at least the final moments of that fine movie as they hear him talk about the phrase, we'll see, and apply that to Syria and everything else in the Middle East. But what should people have when they look at the agency? Curiosity.
Yeah.
Studying history. Languages are tools and allow you to understand souls of others. Solving puzzles that involve people. Understanding who's on the other side of the table. Writing well. Being able to tell stories. I don't have a great sense of humor, but a sense of humor helps. Empathy for others, to include adversaries.
Yeah.
An ability to work very hard and understand that nights, federal holidays, and weekends were made for intelligence work. Duty is a big deal. I'm going to expand that in a moment, because it also requires some sacrifice, particularly of families. It's very hard on families.
Spouses, children, all of that.
Grateful for what they've done. But in the end, you're part of something bigger. And that not only needs to motivate you, but it needs to contain you, because this job is never about you. And I also say, rising in the organization, I was just amazed the agency never found out what a dud they had in me. But I always tried to associate myself with the fastest group of horses. If I was the head of a race, I wanted a faster race.
Right.
I always had great people. You want people of different disciplines around you, not because they know something you don't know, but they look at something differently from you. And suddenly you can look at that perspective, makes you a better officer. Last, I would say, go where you're told, vice where you want to go. I came in speaking, I can say this, decent French and decent Russian. Right. I had my chance to go to the Bolshaya Kapusta, the big cabbage, but Gus got to me first and in essence said, these things are happening with Palestinian terrorists in Iran and the Iran-Iraq war, and lives are on the line. And why the heck are you not working instead of listening to me?
So this was in the 80s when he was doing the Charlie Wilson's War.
Yes. And I will tell you, coming in at 6 a.m. in the morning, Gus was a very demanding person. And
he beat you in.
No, at first, yes, but you learn very quickly, no. But I may have had a reputation of being demanding in my career at times, but it's hard not to demand everything when they're literally your lives at the other end.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to say, I'm going to go home early or take Christmas off if Al-Qaeda, the Iranians, are working through Christmas.
Right.
I mean, it's just hard to say, you have people in bad places and I'm going to be home for Thanksgiving. So my family endured an awful lot, or maybe they were lucky I wasn't at home. But either way, it was a tremendous honor. And if I could give one message to maybe somebody from the intelligence community who's listening, first of all, thank you. I'm not sure why you're listening to this instead of working, but thank you all very much. And I miss you all dearly.
Well, thank you. And if probably the two lessons you could impart to the next generation, if I could sum up, is work hard. Because when you said you went to night school and things like this, you got to where you went through hard work. And if you really want to, and then second, your commitment to public service and to what this nation stands for, which I think is rare. And I appreciate you. I really value the friendship and your intellect and your mentorship, the advice you give here as part of the board of advisors on the Iran program. But thank you for your time and appreciate spending all this time with you, Norm.
It's been a pleasure, Brian. Thank you for your friendship and for your wisdom over many years. And thank you to MEI for what it does. Work harder.
Thanks. That's all the time we have this week. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in and to our colleagues for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to all our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Brian Katulis. We'll see you all next time.